our current path, meant as a means of securing prosperity, it has unwittingly trapped us in a system that is, we would say, incapable of building lasting prosperity. And so let's define that a little bit more closely. In a strong community, you need to have financial solvency. You have to be able to cover the costs long-term that you're racking up. And we understand this from a personal budget perspective, from our households. We understand this if you are a small business owner or a large business owner. I grew up on a dairy farm, and so I knew exactly, or much of what my dad's burden was to make sure that he had cash flow, to make sure that he could afford, when we expanded our shop, that it was rational for him to do so, to make sure that he was prepared for market downturns, as well as to take advantage at times of upticks in milk prices, other opportunities that came along, but all the while knowing that we need to be very discerning about how we approach our communities. But in our North American landscape, a lot of our places began to turn to an idea that said, well, customer service matters most. So let's expand our hours. Let's get a better community center. Let's continue to get reelected or elected for the first time with larger and more significant promises. And much like me, impressing my wife with an amazing dinner, and I'm like, oh, sure, get another bottle of wine. Why don't we have double dessert? And then when the bill comes, we'll pay $15 up front, and we'll say when our son shows up, he's going to cover the rest of the cost. An intergenerational dine and dash. And we're going to talk about the way in which we've racked up these infrastructure bills that only over time come due, so that up front you get to enjoy a lot of great new things. The community of Norman, Oklahoma is an example where we were working with their community leaders. They had built a $67 million library. Gorgeous, lovely. Poor building practices meant that within 4 years it was closed down due to mold and water infiltration. Now the community was suddenly regretting that $67 million that they had. It wasn't that they found coins and put the money in and built it. They had borrowed against future generations and said, in the future, we'll deal with the full long-term cost of dealing with this because we want to enjoy this right now. Poor design decisions meant that they also then couldn't even enjoy it at that time. So what are the short-term costs? Absolutely. But also, what are we paying to maintain or replace for generations to come? Now, tied to this, and the reason why, if you connect with the Strongtown Sioux Falls folks, and if you continue to sort of work your way into this world of obsessing about these things, or caring about them is another way to put it, in that context, we become very focused on the way in which we use land. So zoning reform, for example, is saying, how do we create the conditions in which most people are able, if they are property owners, to be able to meet local needs and not be locked in for 60, 80, 100 years beyond sort of the state at which they first build something, that it has to stay that way in perpetuity. On our farm, almost every couple of years, we were adding on to outbuildings. We were continuing to build new corrals. We were continuing to create opportunities, and yet our communities made it really difficult for this to happen. We actually promised that you could build entire neighborhoods all at once and build them to a finished state, and then they would stay in that condition forever. And so when we think about the financial capacity of our places, a key element of it is to ask, well, how do we measure financially productive communities? How do we measure financially productive streets? How do we measure financially productive lots? And this is not, miles per gallon was not some devious method of the auto industry to try to take a different tack for marketing. But one of the recognitions is if you slipped a slip tank on the back of that F-150, you could probably drive almost 800 miles, depending on the size of the slip tank and what your purpose was. You could go further on one tank. But we generally don't measure vehicles based on just how much can you fit in a tank and how long can you drive with that single tank. Instead, we say, well, how much input is required to get the necessary output? And there are lots of reasons why you would pick one of these vehicles over another. They may have different values for them. But we've come to understand that miles per gallon is a really good way for us to understand the productivity or the usefulness of that vehicle, how efficient it is in doing a thing, which is creating movement, for an input, which is adding the fuel. And in that context, we want to think about our cities. Now, this is north of the border, Cochrane, Alberta, but the work of Urban 3, which is an organization that I'll reference several times, what they do is they try to do what they call a financial MRI. They try to peel back the layers and say, where are the communities? Where is wealth being created? Where is it sort of evaporating? And in this context, what's interesting in Cochrane is that it is a city outside of Calgary, Alberta. It's got lots of residential subdivisions that have begun to pop up in the 70s, 80s, 90s, and especially in the last 20 years. And in that context, they've been building up on the hillsides. They've been doing all of that. But on a per acre basis, their old downtown and their new downtown are significantly more financially productive. The trouble is, the new stuff that they're building, even at its newest state, is not keeping up with what they used to build. And so with deep love for cowboys and farmers, this is what the cowboys and farmers were building. This is what people with simple structures were doing, one-story, two-story structures. So we're not talking towers here. This is Cochrane, Alberta. If you've never heard of it, that's the point. It's just the know-nothing places. They knew a lot. They knew things in a common way, but they weren't trying to do sophisticated things, building towers on the prairies. They were working in very careful increments to use land and use it well. $21 million per hectare it's funny, US company does it in hectares for the Canadian audience, even though Canadians actually use acres for most things. So for the rest, we're going to talk in acres. But this is in Fargo, North Dakota. I ran the numbers, and I wanted to do it for here, but I ran out of time. I was having to pull together data from 3 different sites, your GIS mapping tools, as well as your property assessors tools. So I know you're not in North Dakota, but here's a Fargo example. So that we're going to go down one street, largely down one street. So this is in Fargo. You've got a site. It's worth $1 million. It's consuming 0.10 of an acre, but it is valued at $11 million an acre. Then you continue to go down that street, even this little building here, on a 0.13 acre site. This is what was previously being constructed. These were the normal ways in which we built up our communities. Slightly larger acreage, but more value with that third story. Now, one of the challenges is that in Fargo, as well as many other places, they said, wouldn't it be great if, to meet all of our expected parking demand, we would simply demolish a whole bunch of buildings? Rather than even leaving them as a bare lot and allowing more construction to occur over time, instead you start to see this significant drop-off that you're consuming more land and getting significantly less for it. And yes, there's going to be a parking requirement. There's always a market requirement for parking. People are going to need some elements of it. But the question is, what should we be making the easiest? What should we be making the most of in our communities? And I would argue that one of the things that you need is just a lot of activity, a lot of buildings, a lot of opportunities on smaller lots to be able to create small businesses. Here in some of these areas, this is, again, an aerial view of Fargo. But in the community, you would have dozens, if not hundreds, of different owners of these parcels, all with the opportunity to invest at various times along the way and to continue to flesh out and develop the community. But if you go down the same road just a little bit further in Fargo, you get, and we see this change in the development pattern over time, you begin to see a change in the way that this is a slightly larger lot. You've now reoriented it, so that way you've got more of the building pushed away from the street. That was in the 1960s, 1970s, grappling with the introduction of the automobile. It was, let's keep it away from the street. And so the value per acre begins to drop here, compared to structures like here, here where you're significantly higher performing than what you've got in sites like this. But if we continue on, we can see a little bit of what our ancestors built, right? So this is a little lawyer's office, if I recall correctly. This is coming in a tiny little site. You ask, who can afford to pay $131,000? Probably a lot of people in the community. Who is able to keep up a property like this? Probably a lot of people in the community. And in that context, on just 0.7 acres, you're creating a significant value store. You're capturing all of that value within the community. And you can see something similar beginning to happen. They're making more of the lot with the new buildings, mimicking what the older buildings were already always doing. It's in this context we also see here's, this was built but then rebuilt in 1947 and then refurbished later. Larger lot, we're starting to see that shift. We're more auto-oriented as we do this. This is an office park just a little bit further down. And then we get even a little bit more. What if we fully pull it away from the road? This is peak sort of auto-oriented development, right? This is what we enabled. This is what our zoning standards said. Hey, this is what it takes to be remarkable, much like every other community that began to adopt these standards. The trouble is, this is that telling marker that says, well, you're having to have a lot more activity occur on a much broader plane in order to bring in the same amount of property and sales taxes would otherwise be occurring. And so in this context, then, the new things that Fargo celebrated, what put Fargo on the map as having finally arrived was getting a Chick-fil-A. In our city, it was always, we'll one day get an Olive Garden. But in that context, you can ask the question, well, this is using 1.43 acres. That's a lot of land with a fairly low return here. And we compare that even more with the Target, where it's like, all right, now we've arrived, we've created the conditions in which you can have a single stop to do all of your shopping. But the consequence to the community is we're going to generate very little in economic activity on a per acre basis. Yes, that Target is going to generate sales tax revenue, but on a per acre basis, you're dividing every single receipt by 10, rather than in some of these much smaller sites where it's on a 0.10 acre site. So you could have 10 of those style structures, creating a significant amount of property tax and sales tax revenue as you go along. In my city, our local McDonald's pays 1/7 the amount of property tax that our little coffee shop does on a per acre basis. I don't know about you, but I mean, the culinary delight of the McGriddle probably is not worth us subsidizing it to such an extent. Or reverse, the reason why that cup of coffee in that little coffee shop is more is because on a daily basis, they're paying more property tax for the amount of land that they are consuming than the McDonald's does. And the reason is because we immediately understood, as we shifted development patterns, that we need to discount land set aside for the movement and storage of automobiles. And it seems right, where you're like, well, that's not productive land. Instinctively, our assessors understood this. That parking lot isn't helpful except to drive business in the building. But then we go and we look at our downtowns, and yes, you do want to have parking, you do want to provide those spaces, you want to use your public streets well, even park cars in what could otherwise be travel lanes, narrow some of those lanes so that way you create the conditions in which more people can be downtown. But in doing so, you would open up a significant amount of land and opportunity. And the reason why this matters from the perspective of talking about property taxes, do they have to go up? Should they stay low? Is there anything that we can do in this context? Is that we're really faced in a situation where we can either cut services, which people are loath to do. It's a real burden to more of our community if we cut services, especially in disproportionate ways. We're quick to cut services in older neighborhoods, even while we're rolling out new stuff in new neighborhoods. We need to be oh so careful about doing that, or we just raise taxes. And at Strong Towns, we say the third way is to change our development pattern. And at minimum, to get out of our own way in allowing for the redevelopment of locations, the redeployment of community land in order to do a better job with it, to make more of it. To, if it's your Ford F-150, to make sure its tires are properly inflated. That'll go a little longer and help along the way to make sure that you're not always towing an extra horse trailer with you or whatever that might be. And this is an example in Mount Vernon, Washington, so clear on the other side of the country. 27 acres for the Walmart. Again, for the movement and storage of vehicles, consumes a lot of land. But the promise was, we get a Walmart, we get all this revenue. Meanwhile, a bunch of hippies at the co-op are selling rutabagas for $5, and they are consuming just 0.22 acres. And so when it comes to tax time, you can imagine the jet coming in from Bentonville, and you can imagine the procession with a ceremonial bagpiper waiting for them as they bring $327,000. Thank you, Mr. Walton. Thank you for coming. Meanwhile, the hippies show up with their quarters and their pennies for bringing in their $27,000 on an annual basis. And you say, well, okay, thank you. You're just one of many. And I think our local business associations really need to do these types of numbers. Because if you were to compare, in order to get the same amount of tax revenue that the Walmart brings in, that $327,000, if you did it at the intensity of the food co-op, in the way that our ancestors instinctively built, you would only be consuming 11 squares. You would only be taking in that portion of that land, leaving much more that you could be developing in this site. So this is where that food co-op is. And you ask the question, what is it about this space that allows it to store lasting prosperity? To store private capacity, from which we then take a fraction of that private capacity and we tax it, and we use those taxes for the provision of public goods. No matter, I'm a Canadian, so I can talk taxes without immediately outing myself on one side or the other side of it. I'm a libertarian socialist, I'm a mess. But if we think about taxation, we will accept if we want something in the public realm. We want running water, we want garbage picked up, and we want streets. We want libraries, we want pools, we want a few more things. In that context, we accept we will take from our private capacity a portion and allocate that to the public realm. And we do this on an ongoing basis as sales tax or property tax. That's the only way that the commonwealth or the common good is maintained. And so we need many participants taking a portion of what they have and putting it into the common realm. Which also requires our civic leaders to be really good stewards of that. Remember, there's only one wallet. Federal, state, and local priorities all have to be funded from it. And that wallet is backstopped by private capacity. And so unless you're a radical Marxist or an anarchist, everyone else is accepting of the stance that we need some level of private capacity in order to be able to provide for the public realm. And in this context, one of the challenges that we have is that we move to a development pattern that leaves a lot of potential value on the table. And we know that from the example I shared from Cochrane, where their downtown, what the farmers and cowboys built, is more productive than the new stuff that they were building. And putting out press releases and saying, we welcome Hampton Inns to Cochrane because now we have arrived. Meanwhile, the little tea shop says, hello. Each time that you celebrated a good chunk of change coming in from Bentonville, you were leaving 9 of those bags on the side and saying, oh, we can probably do without them. And we can't. We can't. And at minimum, we can make sure that we're not standing in the way of even Walmart beginning to redevelop its parking lots. Even Walmart beginning to reorient the way that they think about the use of land, partly out of private self-interest. And I'm like, I'm there for it. But also making sure that in the context of the public realm, the public is being increasingly taken care of as well. And so this is, here in Sioux Falls, vestiges of the original development pattern are evident here. You can see this in our residential neighborhoods. We can see this in the much more careful use of scarce resources in the land that we have. There's a reason why our ancestors, it wasn't simply because they were poor that they lived closer together. In fact, if you were wealthier, you lived even closer to the downtown. You lived closer to the center of all the activity. You lived in community with other people, but you were also able, in various places you would consolidate some lots together, but we generally would not have quarter-acre lots or one-acre lots, except if you were truly out in the rural areas. You can see this also in just the many different participants here, owners that have changed hands over the years, all contributing to the local tax base, all generating lasting value. And all the gray reminds us of some of the damage that we have done by quite quickly stepping in and saying, we should probably add more parking. There is no one that's bought a t-shirt that says, Sioux Falls, I came here for the parking. And yet a lot of our communities really wrestled with this. I know in my city, we had an urban renewal scheme that was created in the 1960s. And I love that in a previous age, they called it the urban renewal scheme. That's great. But it basically recommended tear down all of the old buildings, all of this sort of stuff, because it was all blighted. Guess which parts of our community are the places that we're glad that we saved? That we didn't have the money to pay for bulldozers is a godsend, because that's the very places that make our community great. We have a village core that's vibrant, that's active, and that's the areas that our previous generations looked at and said, let's get rid of that. We want the Olive Garden. We want Chick-fil-A. And you can see this. You've got a Red Robin, you've got a 7 Brew, you've got the Empire Mall, but the trouble is, what is the productive land use pattern here? Is this more like a Ford F-150 with a broken fuel injection system and deflated tires, dragging a big concrete thing behind it, consuming a lot of land to do much less than you might otherwise have? And what is the path forward? How do we begin to address what we've done here? Even notice the contrast of, yes, you do have some significant roads and streets here, but just the sheer amount of asphalt that you can see, that the roads required to service this type of development pattern. The proximity to the highway that many different hands have to contribute to. In this context, we need to be ever so careful. So my brother or friend here shared, name dropped Medicine Hat. I was like, well, you must be ready. Medicine Hat, Alberta, they did a really interesting thing where they mapped out the different sort of generations of their community. The areas as the community began to develop. And what was striking is then they did a second layer, and this would be an awesome exercise to do in Sioux Falls as well. Your GIS portal, which is your mapping portal, says, make use of our data or something like that. I love the public encouragement, do this. But they took a look at all of their building permits. And they said what's so interesting is that here you can see sort of that radial spreading outwards. And they actually went and they started looking at their downtown and they said, well, I think we messed something up in the model. Because that model is, or that core of our downtown is like this potpourri of colors. All these different decades in which development has been occurring, as turnover is occurring, as people are going and booking in more permits, asking for more activity to take place. But these are the conditions of revival. These are the conditions of constantly adapting to meet local need. Whereas this represents much more of the tradition, now the suburban development pattern, which has really locked most of our communities into a condition which is hard to introduce change. People are resistant to the imposition of new growth around them, in part because it is difficult to service growth in these areas. It is difficult to run transit out to more neighborhoods to make them a little bit more accessible to more people. It's difficult to provide sufficient community school coverage, to round up enough buses to be able to ensure that you can meet your needs. And that's where we say at Strong Towns, we can't keep squandering our land. One of the ways in which we see this in Kansas City, this is South Bend, Indiana. One of the challenges that they had is in the 1960s, they said, let's go all in on a suburban development pattern. That was, to them, a way in which you signaled that you had arrived. No longer would you build in sort of this haphazard, sort of scattered way, a way in which every so often there would be a new structure going up, there would be other stuff going down. Sort of there was this constant evolution within the core areas. Remember, keep that Cochrane image in mind. That's what that looks like. Those low-slung buildings, most of that is what you would see in Medicine Hat as well. But in 1960, 132,000 people. And guess, if you can get away with having 3 lift stations for your sewer system, one, either you're not dealing with anybody's poop, or you actually have a fairly compact pattern or compact area to take care of their needs. And we see this. They had limited miles of force main per person, a limited number of lift stations. And in South Bend's case, they actually lost population in the ensuing 40 years, and yet had dramatically increased the amount of obligation that they had. And one of the challenges that we face in our communities, my sister-in-law just got elected as a city council member in Winnipeg, Manitoba. In Winnipeg, large city, they've done the suburban development pattern en masse. And she said, every budget season, it's like, all right, we're gonna cut $10,000 from the city forestry department. We have to close more of the hours for the arts center. The library's gonna take a cut. Meanwhile, 87% of the city's actual costs were related to sewer and roads and keeping all these things up, as well as the looming recognition they have way more to take care of than they will even be able to manage. The potholes, the expectation of street replacement, all of those contracts. And so she said there was at one point where there was a path that was being considered for a shortcut in a park. It was a long, contentious debate over $60,000. And then the road resurfacing budget went up for, I think it was 30 million or something, and it was passed without consideration. And so we can get really obsessed about the little stuff, but if we're missing the big challenge for ourselves, similarly in Kansas City, 1.8 times increase in the number of people able to pay for stuff, but they're responsible to pay for 27 times as much stuff. So you get a sewer pipe, you get a sewer pipe, you get a sewer pipe, to the point where in Kansas City, it's 30 feet of sewer pipe per person. Now, I like getting presents, and I like having a child be given maybe a community benefit of some sort, free swimming lessons, but I'm less enthusiastic about them having a lot of pipe. And tied to that, I would actually be okay if my child got a little less pipe, if we made a little bit more effective use of that pipe, because then I know that in the net, in the whole, our whole community would actually be better off. If we can spend less on this, we can spend more on other things, and that can look like, spending more can look like even tax cuts, that can look like reducing, or that can look like reallocating to catch up on other types of maintenance. In the case of Norman, Oklahoma, to hire a slightly better building designer to make sure it doesn't rain, or that the rain doesn't come in during thunderstorms. Which I saw in there are many thunderstorm warnings for around here. I was like, oh, that's interesting. I've never seen it on the TV like that. San Antonio, again, you're a long ways away from San Antonio, but they'd be able to drive here really easy. If they were to stretch out all of their single lane road, they could go to Las Vegas by way of New York City. So this was from last year running the numbers, 700 miles of stormwater pipe, the big expensive ones to keep up, the ones that crack over time, the ones that are challenging to maintain because you have to dig everything up. They've got a lot of it. And this is the challenge that your community, actually, some good news is going to come out towards the end, but your community is in better financial position than many, which is really healthy, which is good, but you certainly have challenges as well. And one of those challenges is that we insisted after the Second World War, there's a whole backstory here, but that we could build neighborhoods all at once to a finished state. And we could essentially, from a Strongtown's critique, leave them in a state of perpetual adolescence. If you have kids, and I have an 11-year-old, I love that he's 11. But I'm also kind of looking forward to when he's 18, and then I'm really looking forward to when he picks a nursing home for us to live in. We know that, and we expect him to grow, to gradually mature, to begin to develop additional capacity. And it's in this context, this is a picture in Delta, British Columbia, where I live. This is one of our little residential suburbs. If you go down, there's a little car here, it's a little bit hard to see. The trees are a little bit bigger, and I think they did fill in the corner lot, and that car's been upgraded, but otherwise things are essentially still the same. And that is the challenge, that if we now are still following the same pattern, we build all at once to a finished state, and then we leave it as is. And the challenge is that we've made this hard for ourselves. We've continued to sort of double down. And actually, I'll pause here because three sort of core elements that I think we need to seriously grapple with in the context of the suburban pattern of development are these three. The first is the assumption of auto-dependency. What you see here by devoting the most substantial part of that lot to the movement and storage of vehicles is the assumption of auto-dependency. This is right next to an industrial area in Lethbridge, Alberta, where I grew up. You can see the ways in which they have reserved all of this land for future roadway expansion, as if they don't have enough capacity already here, for a highway that will never actually be built, but they've reserved all of that extra space. And then, so the building gets pushed way further away from established neighborhoods on this side, and then we create the conditions in which now each of these vehicles is assumed to need a parking space at any location it may choose to go to. In fact, there should be many parking spaces, and in fact, we should make sure that if a church is present in a neighborhood, that it is not allowed to share its parking spaces with a dance studio, and we create all of these conditions, and we use the veneer of math and parking requirement ratios in order to try to come across as saying, we've got this figured out. But what we've figured out is a way to squander a vast amount of land and create the conditions for ourselves in which we've actually boxed ourselves in, that rather than people saying, I can drive into a neighborhood, park once, and safely navigate through the neighborhood, or drive to my downtown area, find a parking space, and then because it's pleasant, because it's enjoyable, I don't need to get back in my vehicle in order to be able to go to my next location, I just continue to carry on. Yes, even in the cold. Even in the rain, even in the conditions, we can create those things. And so that's the trouble of the assumption of auto-dependency is in the documents themselves. The second is strategic exclusion by class or status. If you had to guess, do rich people or poor people live in these buildings? Well, the fact that it says rent with us is probably a tell. This is designed to be lower income. It's next to the industrial park. It's next to the land that they say may eventually become a highway. And you know what? It's okay for us to provide lots of different types of housing at different income levels, but we saw the flip side, which is community leaders, and it's in the documents themselves said, hey, we can use minimum lot requirements, minimum lot or minimum like building size requirements. So you have to build to a certain size. You can't build small. You can't build on small lots. You must have ample parking. We can use all of those tools to keep the poors away. And deliberately, every community began to do this, creating the conditions in which now it was difficult, if not impossible, for anyone to be able to find their way into a community. I got a question for you. How many of you have lived in a home or a housing unit that was 500 square feet or less? So put up your hand if you've lived in a place 500 square feet or less. Oh, I always do this wrong. How many of you, it's supposed to be, how many of you would like to live in a housing unit that's 500 square feet or less? And then many in the room don't put up their hands. And then you say how many of you have, and most people put up their hands. It's that contrast that what we expect today might not actually be what we needed before. And the same thing holds true for our lives. Yeah?
How much square feet is this room?
This would be 800? Yeah, roughly? Yeah. A little more? 2,000? This whole room?
Yeah.
All right. I love it.
Yeah.
Good.
Convert that to Canadians.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so if the strategic exclusion by class or status is that second core component, then the third is resistance to change, or the assumption that change is not needed. But we live in the midst of change. Newton tells us that stuff breaks down. So we're constantly having to deal with breaking things. We're constantly having to deal with degrading things. Children grow up. We don't want them to stay in a state of perpetual adolescence, and so we want to continue to build our places. This is north of you in Fargo. This was just two images from 1931 and 1929. But to illustrate the change in development pattern, you can go and look at Main Street and Broadway now, and you see a very different pattern. And in the article, Jen Kinney actually interviewed a couple of people and said that in the advance of the efforts that they made actually recently to sort of reestablish a more active street, something closer to what it used to be, they actually faced a lot of pushback. People said, oh, you can't do this. But once they began to introduce little bump outs and other types of street parking, other traffic slowing devices, it created the conditions for a really vibrant, active place. More people doing more things, spending more money, enjoying more company together in this space compared to Maine that had been assigned its new status as sort of the emblem of what it is to develop a more suburban style community. And in that context, the quote was, no one I spoke to could say exactly how we came to prioritize cars over people, but we know that we did it. And we can see, if we look at the financial capacity of places like this compared to the sites that occupy it here, we know that this represents a serious drop-off in the financial performance of our places. Because the traditional development pattern was driven by local needs. It was about creating more opportunities through proximity. If you want to cause some people to squirm, you say, move those buildings closer together. They go, whoa, we can't do that. But actually, it's the dilution of our development pattern that has created a significant obligation to us. The infrastructure as we spread things out, the difficulty it is to be able to link several of your activities together in one spot, the realization that by diluting our development pattern, it increases response times for fire services. You have, interesting, the best response times across the North American landscape on a per capita basis is in Queens, New York, for fire services. Because they can justify a serious investment in fire services because they have lots of buildings in close proximity to. They're not saying that we need to go and do exactly what they've done, but the irony is people think, oh, we need wide roads in order to be able to respond rapidly to fires. And oh, we need to avoid those places that have sort of too many people living together. Well, too many people is many participants, is many players in the work of building a strong community. And this is my community in Ladner, British Columbia. What's striking to me is if you go on further, we didn't have agricultural land protection at that time. There's kind of this question, why did this even happen? You know, there was a fishing village, so you could say, oh, maybe you need a little store there. But why would you build in close proximity to each other? Why would you have prosperous people living right here and right here? Why would you have a farm mill right in the middle, and then you would continue to build it out? Because you realize that you would create security through proximity. Rather than diluting it and making everybody go their separate ways. You actually created the conditions in which your community could afford to invest in the nicest boardwalk our community has ever had, and we still don't have it back. We could afford to provide for all kinds of different public infrastructure as we went through it. At Strong Towns, we talk about this in the context of allowing the next increment by right. If you're part of the Strong Town sort of world, you'll have come across these stories of Brainerd, Minnesota. If you've never heard of Brainerd, that's fine. It is just an unremarkable place, but they followed a very similar pattern. This is the traditional development pattern. You would have simple settlements, simple structures being constructed. Notice, again, they had the entire state of Minnesota to build in. And they're like, yeah, but I want to be right next to you. Because then, when it came time for it, they could begin, I have to switch my slides. Cars came after horses. So, horses. 1894, they're beginning to now, you can see just in 20-some years, the community has gone from simple shacks on the banks of the Mississippi River to now a much more serious city. And this would be the story here in Sioux Falls as well. I can see the architecture, I can see the buildings where this is the case. And you can start to see the investment in the public realm that is following all of the activity that's occurring in the private realm. I gave it away. And then you can see, by a couple of decades later, they've become even more substantial. They've invested even more. And as a consequence, the community can afford to invest more as well. In-ground sewage, you can see how that's beginning to stretch out. That activity is radiating to more of the community as it thickens up. But then the suburban pattern of development came along and said, all right, let's exclude by class and status. So this is, wealthy people are living here, but we don't know about those folks. We've got to lock this down. So you see the introduction of zoning standards. You see the introduction of parking requirements. You see the expectation that we can begin to spread everything out because the automobile is a great connector. Trouble is the automobile is a very costly connector in human ways, financial ways, and more. And we're not anti-car. I grew up on a dairy farm. We needed our vehicles. But the idea that they are the single use or single best way for us to navigate most of our logistical needs in our communities has been a real challenge for us and comes at significant cost. And you can see that cost played out here. It may be, this is the same part of the city. And it may be that much of the investment capital dried up. Some of those buildings probably had to be demolished. But the thing is, everything that you see in this picture meets the new code. Everything in this picture, including significantly better streets, much better light posts, much more expensive infrastructure that the public realm is taking care of at a fraction of the amount of productive land use that's around it. And the question is, how can you manage if your community has broken itself in this way? And so as you look at specific projects, we'll go for another 7 minutes or so, and then we'll take time for Q&A and discussion generally. So welcome, glad to have you here. We're gonna talk, one of the things that we get pushed back in the Strong Towns world, we insist every municipality is a corporation. It's in the documents themselves. You'll see the Incorporation Act or the incorporation documents. People are resistant. We had a city manager in Florida who was like, it is not my duty to run a profit. I am there to provide services to the community. And he expected us to cheer him and put on his cape and sort of give him laurels. But we said, if you're running your community into the ground, you are maybe providing services right now, but you're not doing so long term. So that we together are shareholders of this corporation. By living here as residents, we opt into participating in the exchange of fees, in the exchange of taxes, in exchange for things that make our community stronger. And this is where we would say that the need that our communities have is to be especially careful about the proximity of our work compared to where we're providing services. One way to think about it is that any project that is near the periphery of your community is likely to have substantial private gain, but at significant public pain. Because you can build on farmland quite easily, you just moonscape it, and then you go and put in a brand new neighborhood. But the public pain is now the school district has to send buses much further. Your tax system is not set up to basically measure how much sewage care you're going to, or sewage care, how much sewage treatment you're going to require on how much length of pipes you are away from the treatment centers. Your water is going to have to be routed out to you. So you can see there's a significant outlay of public expense the further out you get. which is why our communities were quite careful. And if you go to other countries around the world, you'll still see this, that you see rural areas, and yeah, there might be a few farmhouses and other things like that, and then you see villages. And yes, they had a wall because of some people's ancestors being Vikings or cannibals like mine in the Netherlands. They had walls for self-protection, but it was actually primarily an economic decision. If we were to live together, we would share in each other's resources, and we would have projects that were good for the private sector, the individual owning a building or a project, but also it worked for those that were in concert together. And this is that discipline that we look for. In Medicine Hat, Alberta, so we have some great examples from there. Medicine Hat had this large plan to deploy their public resources for the development of industrial sort of shovel-ready land. And so they put in this extra roadway. You can see there's not much activity going on, but they've definitely already sprung for all the value that's been plowed into the ground here. That sun is just causing it to degrade, even as nothing much is happening with it. But out of it, they got a bunch of work. And the challenge is that we said, well, how does it compare to the other stuff that you've done? And they said, well, it's bringing in jobs and it's economic growth. We said, but how does it compare? I love this building. This is in their downtown. On a per acre basis, this is $6.6 million per acre. It's a cheesecake shop and it's called Sugar Daddy's. I'll come back to that in a moment. This is another building in their downtown, so that's a simple, pretty rundown structure in a lot of ways. They've shown it some love, but just a more significant structure, a 3-story structure, clocking in at $11.5 million per acre. Downtown Medicine Hat has a lot of social challenges in it. It's been neglected for a long time, and yet it is holding its own. I said in their community, this is your money pot, not your money pit. In contrast, an industrial park clocks in its brand new state at $0.6 million per acre. And that's not taking all of the land that they set aside for this industrial park. It's just looking at this particular building and saying, for the amount of land that we committed this building to, how much does it return? Well, who are you treated better by? Your brand new arrival or your sugar daddy? Your brand new arrival or the one that has been steadily providing for the community through the years, even if it doesn't get a lot of love. It's not been a cheesecake shop for that long. I'm sure it's been a jeweler before that and an accountant's office, and yet reliably returning value to the community. And so yes, you may get a larger upfront tax payment from this site, but the cost is you've consumed 71 acres in order to generate that activity. And so the question is, how would we go about adjusting our standards so that this could be developed to the density or to the activity level that you see already in the downtown? And so my ancestors in Delta turned up their nose. They said, we need an urban renewal scheme because what we did over there, that's just not working. It's not modern, it's not helping. And this is where Strongtown says, we've made a fateful error in conducting a suburban style experiment. It was okay to try it, but the longer that we know that the experiment is not working, we should probably really stop it. Imagine if you're a science teacher and you are in your classroom and you have strayed beyond sort of the guidebook in terms of what the experiments are that you should normally be conducting in the science lab. And suddenly you've got gouts of fire, you've got children quavering, and you're like, but the experiment must go on. And this is, I'm being a little provocative, I know. But this is what we essentially are doing as we say, hey, I heard that Amazon wants to set up a distribution center. Why don't we do this? 71 acres, we've got land for days. But do we actually have the capacity to cover the real cost of having actually done this? And even worse, now in Medicine Hat, they'd actually rolled out the welcome mat to basically provide upfront all of the upfront investment in order to make it happen. They were expecting $4.9 million in annual revenue, but if any of these projects don't proceed, they're going to be on the hook for even more. We see this all across the North American landscape, and we ask the question, can we be so careless with our financial dollars? And then we use things like tax increment financing to say, hey, we will now give you 20 years up front of your tax dollars back, so that way you can come and build in our community and consume 71 acres. Thank you. If I were Sioux Falls, I would say, go to Fargo, right? Like, carry on, this door doesn't open for you because we want to conduct ourselves in a way that builds lasting prosperity. That image from Cochrane, what our cowboys and farmers built, outperforming us should cause us to wake up. and say, how much do we need that Olive Garden or the new style? I'm going to come over to just as we close, the financial condition of your community. So if you go to your cardiologist, I'm almost at the age where I'm going to have one. My eating levels probably, I just, just a few things, and then maybe I can hold off for a while. But one of the things at Strong Towns that we wanted to do is not look at what we are budgeting for, because that's a lot of projections. Every time you have to battle through passing an approved city budget and making sure it all balances, there are a lot of really hard conversations that occur. But we said that past behavior is bound to be the best predictor of future behavior unless we make significant change. And people really struggle to understand why they should have to make any changes. Well, at Strong Towns, we rolled out what we call the Finance Decoder, looking at your city's annual comprehensive reports. So I was able to get the last 5 years. If anyone knows anyone at the city, I did send in a request for older documents because ideally we would do this over 15 years. But what we looked at is the net financial position of your community. So taking the numbers that are just published in the standardized way, we are looking at these as indicators of financial condition. What is the general condition of the city? And I'll tell you, this is much better than most places. So that's really good. You've inherited an advantage, and you should lean into this. The amount of financial assets that you have compared to the liabilities that your community currently has. If we express that as a ratio instead of a raw number, we can see that for every about $7, $6.50, you have $1 that you owe. So in terms of the money in the bank, the available resources, your city is in a much better managed position, or much more fortuitous. Some of that is because you got large grants, for example, for upcoming construction projects. So I was reading in the 2025 report that you are committed to upcoming projects. So some of that money is already spoken for, but at least you have it, and at least it's available. I'll tell you, Houston, San Antonio, Fargo, way in the negative, really struggling, where they owe way more than each dollar that they have. And that is a real challenge. You're doing other things responsibly, managing interest levels. Interest to total revenues is one that we track. So if your revenues just went up significantly from a large grant, that means you're going to see a downturn in the amount that you have as a ratio. But the reason why we want to be able to track these is to say, are we in a sustainable pattern, and how flexible are we? Do we have the capacity to rebound if things go sideways? We assume good days ahead, but if you've spent any time with farmers, they will tell you it's never a good day. It's always a bad harvest, and there's always trouble ahead. But there's a little bit of discipline in that, of being ever so careful not to spend forward dollars that we should be careful with today. We're not against borrowing outright, but we're saying be ever so careful. Another key one is the condition of your tangible capital assets. So all of the stuff that your city owns, everything, that you own as co-owners, all of those things, if you lump them all together, so that's every street, every pipe, every library, every community center, it has an original cost that's recorded in your documents. And so we took the original cost, and then we compare it as a ratio to its current value. And that current value is assessed not in an actual way where they actually go and measure the pipe and say, all right, how much more lifetime do we have on this? But the accountants are really good at teaching you how to depreciate something for a scheduled period of time. So 25 years on a piece of pipe, 5 years on a fire truck, 2 years, depending on how your police department drives, on a police car. Depending on what it is, you have this outline. And so the community is actually investing its resources in what's needed in order to continue to keep up your community. This is really important. We see a lot of communities where it drops below 60%. Where now they are increasingly, even as they are investing, for example, in the city of Winnipeg, record amounts of dollars in streets. They said, we've never spent more money on our street repairs. And their actual net book value to cost of tangible capital assets was continuing to nosedive. Which means anytime that you replace something, so if you repair a road, it basically should pull that line back up, right? Because it's 100%. It's at its newest state. And so it should pull it back up. And so they were dumping record amounts of money into the dumpster fire and not seeing the value actually increase in their community, noting for them that they are going to have to close more bridges, struggle to keep open even more centers, really battle with this because of a pattern of development that is not sustainable. Lastly, this is another interesting one of just the amount of government transfers to total revenue. So in your community, almost 20% of your annual revenue each year comes from government transfers. No, you can see there's kind of it goes up and down depending on how much your state capital allocates or the federal government or county. But in this context, one of the things that we saw in Fargo is that 40% of their annual revenues were coming from from government transfers. Well, that can be really good if you're on really good terms with Doug Burgum or whoever follows him and other people in the state or in the federal office. But the other challenge is if things take a downturn. And I'm a Calvinist, so I'm allowed to be pessimistic. I expect that we are going to see some really challenging financial times. And in that condition, we have seen it in the past, so that's the best predictor of future behavior. Federal and state governments are going to contract to only take care of their responsibilities. And in our communities, we've called that downloading. We said, oh, the federal government and the provincial governments, they downloaded onto the cities these costs that previously they were covering. I'm very careful about that because most of the time what they were doing is not purely winning votes, but they were basically helping out until all of a sudden they said, oh, what if we don't? These are things like providing for housing in our communities and improvements to our streets that we should be doing. And part of the reason why we have an enforced poverty as communities is because we've taken a pattern of development that doesn't work for us. And so let's close on the question of what do we do about property taxes? Do they have to go up? Your numbers are going to have to reveal what your current patterns look like. You're going to have to grapple with the question of, can we bring more participants in to the process of paying for the things that we want to share together, but at the same time, not do so in a way like the industrial center in Medicine Hat that comes at a significant cost to the public purse. We can be very careful about the things that we say yes to, but we can continue to double down on building greater capacity. One of the most important things that we say at Strong Towns is if you have some funds available, start by identifying the big lofty idea. Where do you want to go? But then ask, what is it that people are struggling with? What is the thing that you observe people are struggling with in our communities? One city council member noticed that small-scale developers were getting stymied by planning. So this council member said, I will walk one project through the process, and went to every single meeting. Half the time was like, why is this meeting happening? The other half of the time was like, why is this so difficult? Then she sat out the vote, and the project did pass, but basically said, we've got to do everything we can to make that low-level activity just common, easy, fluid. And when we do that, that will have a significant opportunity. We remove the complexity from getting things to move forward in our community. We accept a little bit of mess, a little bit of chaos as we do it, but even more fundamentally, ask what is the things that people are struggling with in our community, and then ask what is the next smallest thing that we can do to address that struggle. My city's so bad at this. They will say, all right, we need a study, or we need a consultant. We basically need a master plan. I'm like, you don't need a master plan to fix a sidewalk. But my city staff come back to me and they say, well, we need to have a plan so we can do it on the whole city. I said, by the time you're done the whole city, something else will have come up. Let's just focus on fixing as we go, beginning to really identify where can we address that struggle. Winnipeg is doing one thing really well. They have neighborhood action teams. The neighborhood action team is actually responsible it was a directive of the mayor's office, but their public works department sends a crew to a neighborhood, and they basically work through the whole list. So they don't send the sidewalk person here and then here and then here and then here. But the thing that is most impressive is they basically round up all of the street cleaning and repairs, cutting down the trees, doing whatever they need to do. But if residents walk up to the crews as they're working, they are empowered to say, yep, we'll take care of that too. We're here, we'll take care of that. That is how you can begin to address the struggle that people are facing in the community. And we say, then go and do that thing. Make the small bet, because this can yield high value, high return. This looks like asking your downtown merchants, what's a small thing that we can do that would make an improvement today? What's that small thing that we can do to help assist? Is there an awning that we can help improve? Is there a small grant that we can give out? There's low-level things that can have a significant, profound impact, and then repeat the process. And this is where we believe that this is how we can build lasting prosperity. So property taxes, core to the way and property sales tax, the whole stack of how we fund our local services. But when we do this together, when we take that ownership, when we contend with what we've done, but also where we can go, then we'll build strong towns. And until that happens, or as that happens, collaborate with Jordan, with other members of the Strong Town Sioux Falls group. They're saying, let's shift the conversation. You have elections coming up. You will have elections again. I'd love that not only this season, but the season that follows, you say, oh, there's been a marked difference in the types of conversations we have 4 years from now than we're having right now. And that will be the success of this room. That will be the success of this effort. And with that, I hope that we've touched on a few things that we can talk about as we carry on. So let's go to questions. Any thoughts, questions, rebuttals, objections, complaints? So the parking is, in that instance, there was 2 spaces at the back. So there were, and then that was off of the alley. But then also on the front, what used to be parking was, I think in that situation, there was still some parking on that road. So then that's in the public realm. And so it is publicly providing portions of the public realm for street parking. And at Strong Towns, we would say a lot of times that's what we definitely should be doing. Provide, make good use of the public realm for that purpose. Not always, but we can definitely do things like if there's 3 travel lanes, it may be that those 3 travel lanes are not necessary in one direction and one of those can be turned back into parking. Frequently, it used to be parking before that. And we would also say that the difference of like the large lot where the private owner takes care of it all, on the one hand, you say, well, see, perfect. The private owner is going to resurface that lot, but it can never be repurposed for any other public good. It can be, basically, it's a frozen asset that is only of that private user. And the other side of it is that we would say if someone has a demand for parking, they can either modify that building to put a ground floor or a basement parking unit in it. If there was a dance studio and they said, look, we've got 18 families that are going to be showing up every hour. Where do we need to locate ourselves? They're going to take that into consideration. But the accountant or the lawyer would say, hey, my clients are probably able to be a little bit, they can park nearby, walk on over, or I go and meet with them. So we can see a lot of that shifting occur. Now it is, that's a very small parcel, but it does have the available parking at the back. But the other side is being able to, we often assume that we need to be closer to the front door of a location than we are. Oftentimes, and the way that we do this is just to go to your nearest like Walmart and measure from the first retail location, measure out to the first available parking spot. That's generally 2 blocks. Like the distance, depending on how large your blocks are, but from here to the next street, that's pretty close to what you would walk in the North Dakota or South Dakota winter in order to get into the building. And so people's struggle is sometimes, I don't know where parking is. And that's the benefit of the big box stores is you park, exactly where the front doors are because we've marked that well. If I have to go around a corner, I worry, am I too far away? Well, better wayfinding, improved signage, or as I experienced just on my little walk to grab a coffee, if you can create nice little enclaves, I don't mind that walk as well. I don't mind because I felt safe enough, except for a few jaywalking incidents, but I felt safe enough to be able to maneuver through. I said when I got here, it passed the shade test, which is I was able to go from shaded area to shaded area without getting too hot in the sunny bits. That is stuff that like a local small business association, there is more that can be done on that side. It can be asking city staff, what are some techniques that we can use to better address concrete breakage? Paving stones, things like that. Sometimes we say, there's a higher upfront cost. But if you can rapidly adjust the paving stones so that way the tree roots have lifted them, but you can account for that, we can learn to be more adaptable in that way. But it definitely is a factor of large swaths of land that simultaneously are not then taxed on the amount of land that they're using. I mean, they are nominally taxed, but my McDonald's really is only paying for the building that is producing wealth. And then all of the other land area, including sort of fairly large parking areas that they've created, really doesn't factor in very much. So the idea of subsidiarity is a big word for saying take care of your own stuff to a certain extent. So that means that if you have an issue that there's garbage in your front yard, that's probably between you and your child, and so go work it out with them. However, if there's garbage in the neighborhood, talk as a small group of neighbors together, hey, let's address this. if it is actually something that broadly city garbage crews are, throwing off bags so that way they pay less at the transfer station, that might be a situation where you have to then, as the breadth of the issue begins to increase, you have to involve more authorities. So it might be you have to get the legal authorities on board, or you may just have to have the city review its contract. And the idea of subsidiarity is that we need more of the focus and much of the capacity to make decisions to be as close to the problem as possible, unless it can't be resolved at that level. And so if I can't get along with my child, I may need a mediator. I may need an additional person to come in and say whose McDonald's cup was that. And when we think about it that way, this is one of our concerns about state level preemption, for example, is the states right now, all across North America, provinces as well, are basically saying, well, we have powers to basically put out local fires. So we have cities that are sort of holding back, or they're nervous about housing, or they're sort of like restrained in these ways. So we're just going to step in and basically impose on them these requirements. And we've said there may be very limited instances where that is necessary, much like at some point you have to call in a higher authority. But most of the time it needs to be resolved at the local level. And tied into that then, the core principle of subsidiarity is each person has responsibility. And we can't simply waive responsibility to be like, well, I'm a taxpayer, so I don't really care about parking standards. I don't really care about those things. Just keep my taxes low. That, it's fine if somebody identifies that way, but we have, this is Civics 101. We all have a shared responsibility. We're all, I love the language of we're all co-owners, because it tweaks people's minds that are like, I don't own anything. I have a landlord-tenant relationship with the city where I yell at the landlord saying, why haven't you fixed anything? And the landlord tells me, because you haven't paid enough rent. That's not a healthy relationship. We need to have this understanding of ourselves as co-owners and participants in that. So it's subsidiarity. Again, we would say we need bottom-up change rather than top-down sort of imposition of standards. We've gotten into the troubles that we've had through very top-down measures. This community of Greenlee, Arizona, you've never heard of it because there's not a lot there, it's desert. They have parking standards for 20 stories and above towers. Why? Because they just copied and pasted. They imposed standards that had no relevance and no bearing on the community, but they just wanted to do what others were doing. And it seems so reasonable, and that's the trouble with top-down thinking. It's very reasonable. It's good for me, it's good for thee. Actually, this is where we find places with deep sense of independence can make some really excellent decisions about their own future. And I actually wonder about some of your community's financial trajectory being quite healthy, especially compared to most communities. That's a good sign. I think there's that independence there that is to be commended. So, I can get you a slide. So not for Fargo, but for San Antonio, as well as quite a number of other cities that Urban 3 has done. They've made those reports available. Kansas City has one. If you're looking for one that's somewhat closer, I'm not sure the one that would be closest to here. But what that does is they do get access to the sales tax records. It depends on the state, though. A lot of them are really loath to share that information. But we would say that within sort of a general rounding error, what you see on property tax per acre, you would see generally play out much the same. When we do spot checks of what the check from Bentonville is for that Walmart on sales tax, or Washington is more of a mixed state, in that even we've got places where they've got like large auto dealers. And so from the perspective of a sales tax city, you're like, auto dealers are amazing. I mean, that's $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 items. They've got a hefty bill on them. That's got to be, but the consumption pattern of the modern auto dealer means that their vehicle throughput per acre, or their sales tax generated per acre, is actually not that significant when you compare it to equally producing smaller space, your local coffee shops, which you're like, how are they contributing so much? The way that we know that they're contributing that much is none of them are going under. So the idea or the argument would be that like if the sales tax that they were forced to pay out was way too much for them to manage, if it was driving away customers, then they would go out of business. But they plug on, or they roll on And we can see it because the value of those properties, people still want to own downtown commercial real estate because they know they can still get the rents, because the rents can still be justified on business practices. And that's where we can also see it even that the land cost is usually a pretty good approximation of how much capacity for creating value exists in those areas. So let me follow up with you about the Urban 3 maps, particularly around sales tax per acre. They have tax receipts per acre, a number of those other tools. And yeah, you can really right away see where those areas of high productive land use are. And people often, like the Cochrane example, there was various heights, and people often assume that means building height. And it's like, no, that's a 2-story structure, or that's a 1-story structure. It just is on a smaller parcel. It's adjacent to several others that generate value as well. And so I would go toe-to-toe with anyone that's like, oh, we need the big structures on the big lots because that's where our big bills come from. I'm like, yeah, the Walmart brings $327,000 every year. Thank you. But conveniently, the community is not getting 9 times as much that they could otherwise be recovering, even if you chop that in half and said we could have just half of the increase if we change our development pattern. I would say that's still quite reasonable. Yeah, you and then you.
I think
Yeah. To start, like Empire Mall, that type of development pattern is just leaving, the key insight is not to be like, that's the worst. It's to say, don't leave money on the table by leaving it as it is. So create the conditions in which any of those mall owners are allowed to, and even encouraged, to add housing, for example, on the perimeter. We're seeing a lot of that beginning to occur. Something you can double, triple, quadruple the amount of productive revenue coming from that acreage than previously was there. That can look like South Bend, Indiana. So South Bend was the one with the population decline. One of the things that we say, there's not a drop dead moment where the community simply ceases to exist, except for some rare ghost towns. Most of the time they just limp along. People's economic prospects are hampered by the fact that the schools struggle, there's less community services, or they're really dependent on major bailouts from higher levels of government, which may dry up in time. And so what South Bend has started to do is they've realized, because of their reputation of having poor services, degraded roads, and things like this, they were seeing a lot of investors saying like, oh, I've got other choices. I'm not going to invest in South Bend. So they turned to their city members and said, can you build here? And they said, what do you need in order to do it? And some of the builders or people were like, well, I'd like to build, but I don't really know, like I know what I need, a place for my mother-in-law to live. I don't really know how to build it. They said, can we provide you with a pre-approved building plan? So that is one example where they said, here is plans that we have already looked at. We've already gone over the sewage requirements. We know exactly where the meter hookup is going to be. And so the benefit to the member of the community was all of those upfront soft costs were already dealt with because some lucky schmuck had already done it. Somebody had gone through the process, and we're so bad at reusing some of our like Sears catalog style templates to basically recreate more of it. And now they have, I believe it's well over 1,000 new homes have been built, and they have little backyard cottages, or they're duplexes or triplexes, but they fit within the neighborhood. And that's representative of, I think, well over 100 local developers that previously were like, I'm not a developer, I'm a guy that builds things. Or I'm just a lady that's interested in putting some money to work for my community. And so they are seeding a renaissance in South Bend. That is the only way in which you begin to make things a little less worse. I said I was a Calvinist, so my stance is we just need to make things a little less worse. And part of that is being able to recognize, one, the suburban pattern of development is deeply entrenched. So I always say spot yourself at least 40 years before you get too discouraged. But it doesn't mean that you have to simply stand back and say, well, there's nothing we can do. Instead, we can say, well, let's not make it worse. And so I shared about the city of Medicine Hat. They brought in Strong Towns in our Community Action Lab program. And what they recognized is they had won awards in their planning department because they had released a 10-year master plan that called for 100,000 people to be added to their community over time through residential developments. Very standard for Alberta for sort of suburban development. Master plan, or they won awards for it. In the prior 10 years, they'd had 11 people added to their city. So their population increase was plus 11, but they were planning for 100,000. And it was interesting because there was one neighborhood in particular that was built out to the outskirts, a new build, and it met the standards of their master plan. It would have fit in eventually in 10 years within the rest of the build-out. The trouble was, on a yearly basis, they were paying $30,000 to $40,000 to provide services out to those sites because 7 homes had been built there. And so they realized we can't keep doing that, so they're on the hook for those bills. But they've actually reversed course, and they are not following their own award-winning master plan. We met the developer that was especially behind the Northwest Industrial Areas project. He had done really well as a real estate mogul, essentially, in the community, putting together land deals for that site. He was not pleased that we were critiquing what they had done. But then he came around and he said, as a taxpayer, I actually understand what you're saying. But as a business owner, man, this made my work harder. At least I can sell what I've built, but they're not doing phase 2 like they had planned. They're definitely not doing phase 3 or 4. And so it is not to say that we have to just pull up stakes right away, but we can definitely do what we can to, again, make things a little less worse or to staunch the bleeding. One of the challenges, especially in a place where you've got a decent financial position, is to keep that and actually harness that as an asset for your community. Having 6 times more in financial resources than your liabilities right now is a healthy place to be in. But if you think, could we be hit by a serious flood? I'm not sure what other types of natural disasters can strike here. I think you're on the areas that people are realizing they might need to move to because there's fewer tornadoes, any number of like really bad things can still happen. I live in an area where we can either disappear into the ocean or get burned out or flooded. And so we have our own issues. And my city, for every $1 of public asset that we're trying to keep up, we only have $3 worth of privately held property. So that means there's a 3-to-1 ratio. So for every $1 we're trying to keep up, we need to go to somebody who only has $3 of skin in the game and say, can I get a little bit more from you? That's not sustainable over the long term. And so that's where we continue to complain. And again, I'm not very sympathetic to the local leaders when they're like, the federal government is shorting us, the state government is shorting us. I'm like, federal government is responsible for national defense. The state government is responsible for education and any number of other portfolios. Like, it's not that they don't have responsibilities themselves. And if we recognize it's all out of one wallet, we're going to be very careful on that front. So yeah, really important question. Probably Jordan would be able to do a great job also of showing some specific examples of local businesses to be able to do a before and after. So a more run down area and saying, hey, just doing some like street front improvements allowed those businesses to get a couple more tenants. They did this in Memphis on Broad Avenue. And it was just actually residents there, or local property owners. They painted in a protected bike lane along one stretch, and they created basically a buffer so that cars were still parked, but they parked them a little bit closer to the main roadway. And then it created much more of an area for like getting around on a bicycle, but also just like gathering. And it was quiet space. They went from having, I think it was 80% vacancy to then being fully rented out. And it was because the community actually just started painting lines on the sidewalk and on the street. They just began to take ownership. And the city said, 1, it doesn't meet our standards. 2, we don't have much money to be able to keep up our current obligations. So 3, do what you can because it seems to be working. That, from a strong towns perspective, is what bottom-up trial and error and learning from small failures rather than making big bets and having them come up empty really represents. So